Sometimes the very thing we think will destroy us becomes the thing that saves our soul. Deep in the Colorado wilderness, where the wind howls secrets through ancient pines, Ezra Blackwood had spent 3 days tracking what he believed was his brother's killer. The December storm raged against his weathered face as he approached the wildlife research station, his calloused hands gripping the shotgun that had been his father's and his father's before that. For 40 years, Ezra had lived by the mountain's harsh code, blood for blood, justice served with your own hands. But when his boot splintered Sarah Chen's door, and he saw her there, unconscious, 3 wolf pups desperately nursing at her chest for warmth, everything he thought he knew shattered like ice on stone. This woman, who he'd blamed for turning the government against his family's trapping business, was dying to keep these babies alive. The same babies whose mother his brother Danny had shot just days before someone put a bullet in Danny's head. As Sarah's lips moved, whispering Danny's final words about protecting the pack, Ezra realized the killer wasn't the woman lying before him. It was someone who knew those words. Someone family. What do you do when your enemy becomes your salvation, and your blood becomes your betrayer? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind screamed through the splintered doorframe behind him, but Ezra couldn't move. 40 years of mountain living had taught him to read tracks, weather, and danger in the space between heartbeats. What he saw now defied every instinct that had kept him alive in these unforgiving peaks. Sarah Chen's face was blue-white, her breathing so shallow it barely fogged in the frigid air. The 3 wolf pups, no bigger than his fist, pressed against her chest, their tiny bodies trembling as they searched for warmth their dying mother could no longer provide. The woman's thin sweater was soaked through with melted snow, and ice crystals had formed in her black hair. Ezra's finger stayed frozen on the shotgun's trigger. 3 days ago, he'd found Danny's body by Willow Creek, execution-style bullet to the back of the head, his traps scattered like the killer wanted to send a message. Danny had been 23 years younger, born when their mama thought her childbearing days were done. The boy had been soft sometimes, too willing to listen to tree huggers and government types who wanted to shut down everything their family had built since 1892. The Blackwood name meant something in these mountains. It meant you didn't back down, didn't compromise, and sure as hell didn't let outsiders dictate how you survived. When the state started sending biologists like Sarah Chen to monitor their trapping lines, Ezra had warned Danny to stay clear. The woman had been nothing but trouble since she arrived last spring, documenting their catches, filing reports that painted them as poachers instead of the licensed trappers they'd always been. But now Sarah's cracked lips moved again, barely audible above the storm. Tell Ezra the pack. Danny said, "Protect the pack." Danny's final words. The same ones Sarah had whispered when Ezra first kicked down her door 5 minutes ago. Words that should have died with his brother in that frozen creek bed. Ezra's weathered hands shook as he lowered the shotgun. The cabin was small, one room with a wood stove that had gone cold hours ago, shelves lined with research equipment and notebooks, a narrow cot where Sarah had apparently been trying to keep the pups alive with her own body heat. He could see Wolf's milk replacer scattered across the floor, a heating pad with a cord that led to a generator outside that had run out of fuel. She'd been trying to save them. The woman he'd spent 3 days hunting through a blizzard, the woman he'd convinced himself had put a bullet in Danny's brain, had been fighting to keep 3 orphaned pups alive in temperatures that would kill a grown man. The largest pup, a female with darker markings, whimpered and nuzzled against Sarah's neck. Its littermates pressed closer, instinctively understanding that warmth meant survival. Ezra had seen enough death in these mountains to recognize it approaching. Sarah had maybe an hour before hypothermia claimed her, and the pups wouldn't last much longer after that. Should walk away. Should let the cold finish what his brother's real killer had started. Sarah Chen had cost his family thousands in lost income with her reports and her meddling. She represented everything wrong with how the government treated people who actually knew these mountains, who'd earned the right to live by their rules through generations of survival. But Danny's words echoed in his mind. Protect the pack. His little brother, who'd grown soft in recent months, talking about balance and responsibility and other nonsense he'd picked up from college before dropping out to run the trap lines. Danny, who'd apparently shot the mother wolf, illegally since it wasn't wolf season, then somehow ended up trying to save her babies. Ezra holstered the shotgun and knelt beside Sarah, his knees cracking like old timber. Her pulse was thread-thin, her skin cold as riverstone. The smart thing would be to gather what information he could and leave her to the mountain's judgment. He'd survived 58 winters by making smart choices, not emotional ones. One of the pups, the smallest male, looked up at him with clouded blue eyes, too young to understand that the man kneeling above them had come here for murder. Its tiny pink tongue flicked out, seeking sustenance that wasn't there. "Damn you, Danny," Ezra whispered to the storm. "What the hell did you get yourself into?" Outside, the wind howled with the voices of every winter that had ever tried to break the Blackwood family. Inside, 3 orphaned pups and a dying woman waited for someone to decide their fate. Ezra's father had taught him that mercy was a luxury the mountains couldn't afford, but looking at Sarah's face, seeing how she'd chosen to die rather than let these babies freeze, he wondered if his father had been wrong about that too. The question that would haunt him was simple. If Sarah Chen wasn't the killer, then who knew Danny's final words, and more importantly, who in his own family had wanted his brother dead? Ezra's hands moved without conscious thought, muscle memory from decades of mountain rescues taking over. He'd pulled hypothermic hunters from snowdrifts, carried injured climbers down treacherous slopes, but never while questioning everything he'd believed about right and wrong. The propane lantern on Sarah's desk still held fuel. He lit it with steady fingers, then moved to the wood stove. Kindling first, paper from her research notebooks, pages of careful observations about migration patterns and pack behavior that would have infuriated him yesterday. The irony wasn't lost on him as he fed her life's work to the flames that might save her life. Larger sticks followed, then split logs from the pile beside her cot. Within minutes, heat began radiating through the small cabin. The pups stirred as warmth reached them, their tiny bodies pressing closer to Sarah's chest. Ezra had helped birth calves, nursed abandoned fox kits, even hand-fed a bear cub his father had found orphaned near their property line. But these weren't just any animals. They were wolves, the species his family had been hired to control for over a century. Predators that killed livestock, scattered game, disrupted the careful balance ranchers and trappers had maintained since settlement days. Yet watching the smallest male nuzzle against Sarah's throat, seeking the comfort of a heartbeat, Ezra felt something crack inside his chest. He stripped off his heavy coat and wool shirt, the cold hitting his skin like a physical blow. Survival protocol demanded shared body heat, and pride was a luxury Sarah couldn't afford. As he lifted her carefully, positioning her against the growing warmth of the stove, the pups protested with weak mules. They clung to her sweater with tiny claws, unwilling to lose their anchor in a world that had already taken everything else. "Easy," Ezra murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the pups or himself. "Not going anywhere yet." Sarah's breathing remained shallow, but her pulse seemed steadier against his wrist. Color hadn't returned to her lips, but they'd stopped turning blue. Progress, the kind measured in heartbeats rather than hope. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the cabin walls, reminding him that this storm wouldn't break until morning at the earliest. He'd weathered worse. The winter of '98, when an avalanche had trapped him for 6 days in a snow cave with nothing but jerky and melted snow. The spring of '02, when a broken leg had left him crawling 3 miles through slush and mud to reach his truck. This mountain range had tested the Blackwood family for 5 generations, and they'd answered every challenge with stubborn endurance. But this was different. This wasn't man against nature. This was man against the ugly truth that he'd been hunting the wrong prey. Someone in his own circle had wanted Danny dead. Someone who knew his brother's habits, his route that morning, exactly where to find him alone. The list was short and painful. Their cousin Marcus, who'd always resented Danny's education and easy way with people. Old Pete Rawlings, whose ranch bordered their trap lines and who'd been complaining about split profits. Even Sheriff Hartley, who'd been pressuring the family to modernize their operation for months. Or someone closer. The thought made Ezra's stomach clench like he'd swallowed broken glass. The female pup, the one with darker markings, opened her eyes and looked directly at him. There was no fear there, just ancient recognition. Her species had shared this landscape with his for thousands of years before the first Blackwood ever set foot in Colorado. They'd been enemies by necessity, competitors for resources in a land that offered plenty of beauty but little mercy. Danny had understood that better than anyone in recent years. His little brother had started asking questions about quotas, about whether every wolf kill was necessary, about finding balance instead of dominance. Ezra had dismissed it as college nonsense, but maybe Danny had been seeing something the rest of them had missed. Sarah stirred against his chest, her breathing deepening slightly. The cabin was warming now, and the pups had relaxed into natural sleep for the first time since their mother's death. The scene should have felt peaceful, but Ezra's mind churned with darker possibilities. If Sarah lived, when she lived, he corrected himself, she'd want answers about Danny's death too. The boy had apparently shot the mother wolf out of season, but then tried to save her babies. That spoke to guilt, to someone who'd acted in panic rather than cold calculation. Danny might have been soft, but he wasn't cruel. Something had driven him to make that shot, something desperate enough to risk everything. The storm would pass by morning, but the real weather was just beginning. Someone had murdered his brother and let Ezra hunt an innocent woman through a killing blizzard. Someone had counted on mountain justice taking care of loose ends without asking uncomfortable questions. They'd miscalculated. The Blackwood family had survived 5 generations by protecting their own, but they'd also survived by facing hard truths when comfortable lies became dangerous. As Sarah's pulse grew stronger beneath his palm, Ezra made a promise that would have shocked his father. This time, mercy wouldn't be a luxury the mountains couldn't afford. This time, mercy would be the weapon that exposed a killer. The warmth from the wood stove had barely begun to chase the death chill from Sarah's skin when Ezra heard the sound that changed everything, the distant growl of snowmobile engines cutting through the blizzard's howl. His body went rigid against Sarah's back. 3 machines, maybe 4, approaching from the valley road. The storm should have made travel impossible, but someone was determined enough to risk broken necks and frozen limbs to reach this cabin tonight. In 40 years of mountain living, Ezra had learned that desperation drove men to attempt the impossible, and desperation usually meant guilty consciences. The pup stirred restlessly against Sarah's chest, sensing his sudden tension. The smallest male whimpered, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the cabin's fragile warmth. Ezra's hand moved instinctively to his shotgun, then stopped. Whoever was coming had heard his shots earlier, the ones he'd fired to announce his arrival before kicking down Sarah's door. They knew he was here, knew he'd found her. The question was whether they'd come to help or to finish what someone had started 3 days ago at Willow Creek. Sarah's eyelids fluttered, consciousness swimming closer to the surface as her core temperature slowly climbed. Her lips moved against his shoulder, forming words he couldn't quite catch. But her body remained limp, helpless, a liability if those engines belonged to the wrong people. The same people who'd put a bullet in Danny's head and counted on Ezra's rage to eliminate the only witness to whatever had really happened that morning. The sound grew louder, more distinct. 4 machines definitely, riding hard despite conditions that should have killed their engines miles back. Professional work, the kind that spoke to serious preparation and serious stakes. Ezra's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. If someone had murdered Danny to protect a larger operation, poaching, drug running, something that used the trap lines as cover, then Sarah's research station made perfect sense as a second target. She'd been documenting everything, mapping territories, tracking patterns that might reveal more than wildlife behavior. The cabin's single window faced east, away from the approaching sound. Ezra couldn't see them coming, but he could feel their presence like a pressure change before lightning strikes. These mountains had taught him to trust that instinct, the primitive awareness that separated survivors from statistics carved into headstones in the valley cemetery. Moving carefully to avoid disturbing the pups, Ezra reached for Sarah's research notebooks scattered near the stove. Pages of meticulous observations, GPS coordinates, behavioral notes spanning months of fieldwork. His eyes caught fragments, unusual pack movements in September, signs of recent kills in areas that should have been empty, territorial markings that didn't match established patterns. Sarah hadn't just been studying wolves. She'd been documenting something that someone wanted buried along with Danny's body. The engine stopped. Silence rushed back into the cabin, like held breath suddenly released. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if the mountains themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. Ezra counted heartbeats, his own thundering, Sarah's gaining strength, the rapid flutter of 3 tiny lives that had already lost everything once tonight. Voices carried on the wind, too distant and muffled to identify but close enough to chill his blood. Men calling to each other with the easy familiarity of people who'd worked together before. The tone suggested confidence, not the desperate urgency of rescuers. These weren't good Samaritans risking their lives to help in a crisis. Sarah's hand moved against his chest, fingers curling weakly into his thermal shirt. Her breathing had deepened, but she remained unconscious, trapped in the grey space between hypothermic death and painful awakening. The pups sensed the change in her condition, nestling closer with tiny sounds of contentment. They trusted her warmth, trusted the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. They had no idea that in the next few minutes, that trust might be all that stood between them and another kind of death entirely. Ezra faced a choice that would define everything that followed. He could slip out the back, abandon Sarah and the pups to whatever these men intended. Survival meant cutting losses, and he'd already saved more lives tonight than mountain justice typically allowed. His truck was hidden a quarter-mile down the ridge. He could disappear into the storm and let others sort out the consequences. Or he could stay and fight for 3 wolf pups, and a woman who dedicated her life to protecting the same wilderness that had shaped his family for generations. The woman someone had tried to frame for his brother's murder, counting on Ezra's loyalty and rage to finish their work. The footsteps on the cabin's front steps decided for him. As heavy boots climbed toward the broken door he'd kicked in an hour ago, Ezra wrapped his arms protectively around Sarah and the pups, chambered a round in his shotgun, and prepared to learn whether mercy could survive what was coming through that doorway. The ordinary world, where grief made choices simple and justice wore familiar faces, was about to die in the storm outside. The footsteps paused at the broken door frame, and Ezra felt the familiar weight of his father's voice, echoing through 40 years of mountain wisdom. Never commit to a fight unless you know the ground and trust your ammunition. He knew neither. Sarah's body trembled against his chest, not from cold now, but from the first stirrings of consciousness fighting its way through hypothermic fog. The smallest pup whimpered and pressed closer to her throat, instinctively sensing the tension radiating from Ezra's muscles. His shotgun lay within reach, but firing it meant exposing Sarah and the pups to whatever retaliation waited in the storm beyond that doorway. Should have left when I had the chance. The thought burned like acid in his throat. 3 hours ago, his world had made sense. Danny was dead, Sarah was guilty, and justice wore the familiar face of mountain law administered by mountain men. Clean, simple, the kind of certainty that had kept the Blackwood family alive for 5 generations. Now he crouched in a warm cabin, protecting the woman he'd hunted through a killing blizzard, cradling 3 wolf pups against a chest that should have been hardened against exactly this kind of weakness. His father would have called it sentiment. His grandfather would have called it suicide. Ezra! The voice from outside carried the weight of familiarity. Sheriff Tom Hartley, sounding winded from the climb but unmistakably alive despite conditions that should have killed anyone fool enough to venture out tonight. "Know you're in there, son." Saw the smoke. Relief should have flooded through him. Sheriff Hartley had known the Blackwood family for 30 years, had worked with them on everything from search and rescue operations to livestock predation cases. If anyone could help sort through the mess of Danny's death and Sarah's near murder, it should be Tom. But something in the sheriff's tone made Ezra's finger find his shotgun's safety instead. Too casual, too controlled for a man who just risked his life riding snowmobiles through a blizzard to reach a remote research station. And why had Tom come at all? The radio call about Sarah's condition had gone out hours ago, long before the storm should have allowed any response. Unless Tom had been monitoring communications all along, waiting for exactly this moment. "Got medical supplies," Tom called, his voice growing closer to the door. "Heard about the Chen woman's condition. Figured you might need help." How did he know I was here? The question hit Ezra like ice water. He'd told no one about his hunt for Sarah, had deliberately avoided official channels to prevent interference with what he'd planned as swift mountain justice. Yet Tom had known exactly where to find him, had somehow anticipated that Sarah would need medical attention. The only way that made sense was if Tom had known she was dying before the rescue began. Sarah stirred more urgently against his chest, her breath coming in sharper gasps as consciousness fought its way back. One of her hands moved to cradle the female pup, an automatic gesture that spoke to hours or days of caring for the orphaned animals. Her lips formed a word that made Ezra's blood freeze. Danny. Not a question, not confusion, recognition. "Come on out, Ezra." Tom's voice carried a harder edge now, patience wearing thin. "Storm's getting worse. Need to get her to medical attention before we lose the window." Through the broken door frame, Ezra caught a glimpse of movement, multiple figures positioning themselves around the cabin's perimeter. Too many for a simple medical rescue, too coordinated for anything except a carefully planned operation. His mind raced through the implications like water finding cracks in stone. If Tom was involved in Danny's murder, then the sheriff's department had been compromised from the beginning. Every report about illegal hunting, every complaint about the Blackwood family's trapping methods, every bit of evidence that might have pointed toward larger criminal activity, all of it filtered through Tom's desk first. Sarah's research notebooks lay scattered around the stove, pages of observations that had documented more than wolf behavior. She'd been mapping something larger, tracking patterns that connected to Danny's death in ways Ezra was only beginning to understand. Someone had needed both of them dead, Danny for what he'd discovered, Sarah for what she'd recorded. And they'd counted on Ezra to finish the job, to let mountain justice eliminate the only witnesses to whatever corruption had taken root in these ancient hills. The female pup opened her eyes and looked directly at him, as if sensing the weight of the decision pressing down on the cabin's warm air. Her mother had died for being in the wrong place, when desperate men needed to send a message. Now her babies faced the same fate, caught between human greed and human conscience in a conflict that should never have involved them. Ezra's hand tightened on his shotgun, 40 years of survival instinct warring against something deeper. The knowledge that mercy might be the only weapon left that could expose the truth about his brother's death. Outside, Tom's patience finally broke. "Last chance, Ezra. Come out peaceful, or we come in ready for whatever you've got waiting." The storm howled its ancient song of indifference, and Ezra discovered that some choices could only be made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The space between heartbeats stretched into eternity, and in that suspended moment, Ezra Blackwood made the choice that would strip away everything he'd ever believed about himself. His finger slipped from the shotgun's safety. "Tom," he called back, his voice carrying across the threshold between his old life and whatever waited beyond. "Sarah's alive, the pups too. But we need to talk." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a burned bridge. 40 years of mountain survival had taught him that revealing weakness to an enemy was suicide, but 40 years of mountain survival had also taught him to recognize when the game had changed beyond all recognition. Tom Hartley wasn't coming to help. He was coming to finish what should have ended with Danny's murder and Ezra's convenient rage. "That's good news, Ezra. Real good." Tom's voice carried relief, but underneath ran something colder. "Why don't you bring her out? Get her proper medical attention." Sarah's breathing deepened against his chest, consciousness swimming closer to the surface with each passing second. The female pup shifted in her arms, tiny claws catching in the wool of her sweater as if sensing the approaching danger. Ezra felt the weight of their trust. 3 orphaned animals and a dying woman who should have been his enemy, but had become something else entirely in the space of a single night. No going back. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it brought an odd sense of clarity. His comfortable world, where justice wore familiar faces and truth followed predictable patterns, had died the moment Sarah whispered Danny's name with recognition instead of confusion. Whatever waited beyond that broken doorframe, it couldn't be worse than spending the rest of his life knowing he'd let an innocent woman die to preserve his own certainties. "She's too weak to move," Ezra called back. "Hypothermia. Body temperature's just starting to climb. Then we'll come to her. Stay put." The order carried the weight of authority, but also impatience. Tom was done negotiating. Through the broken doorframe, Ezra caught the subtle sound of safety catches being released, the soft crunch of boots repositioning in snow. Professional movements, executed with the precision of men who'd planned for multiple contingencies. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. Her gaze found his face, then moved to the pups nestled against her chest. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but every word burned itself into Ezra's memory. "Your brother tried to save them," said their mother, "was already dying when he found her. Someone else shot her." The words hit him like physical blows. Danny hadn't been poaching. He'd been responding to a crime already in progress. The illegal kill, the out-of-season timing, the desperate attempt to save orphaned pups that should have been left for nature to claim. It painted a picture of his little brother that made terrible sense. Danny's guilty conscience hadn't come from breaking the law. It had come from being too late to prevent someone else from breaking it. "Who?" Ezra breathed. Sarah's hand moved weakly toward her research notebooks scattered near the stove. GPS coordinates, in the margin notes. Been tracking. Systematic kills. Pattern points to. Her voice faded as boots reached the doorframe. Tom's silhouette filled the broken entrance, backlit by swirling snow and the headlights of snowmobiles arranged in a defensive perimeter. Behind him, other figures moved with military precision. Too many for a rescue operation, too well armed for anything except permanent solutions to persistent problems. "Well, hell," Tom said, his voice carrying genuine surprise as his eyes adjusted to the cabin's interior. "Didn't expect to find you playing nursemaid, Ezra." The sheriff's gaze moved from Sarah's pale face to the pups pressed against her chest, then to the scattered research notebooks that represented months of careful observation and documentation. Understanding flickered in his expression, not the confusion of a man discovering unexpected complications, but the calculation of someone realizing his timeline had been shortened. "She say anything useful before you found her?" Tom's question sounded casual, but his hand rested on his sidearm with practiced readiness. Ezra felt Sarah's fingers curl weakly into his shirt, a warning as subtle as breath on cold air. She was conscious enough to understand the danger, aware enough to recognize that whatever she'd discovered about Danny's death had followed her to this remote cabin. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Ezra could still salvage some version of his old life, hand over Sarah and the pups, accept whatever story Tom constructed about noble rescue attempts and tragic outcomes, return to his mountain cabin and let the comfortable certainties close over him like snow-covering tracks. Or he could step fully into the unknown territory that mercy demanded. "No," he lied, his voice steady despite the shotgun trembling in his grip. "She's been unconscious since I found her." The lie crossed his lips like a burned bridge collapsing behind a fleeing army. There would be no retreat now, no return to the simple world where Sheriff Tom Hartley wore the white hat, and justice followed familiar patterns. Tom's smile was winter-cold and twice as deadly. "Shame. Guess we'll have to work with what we've got." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees with Tom's words, despite the fire still crackling in the stove. Ezra watched the sheriff's eyes catalogue every detail, the positioning of Sarah's body, the scattered notebooks, the precise angle of his shotgun. This wasn't a man assessing a rescue situation. This was a predator calculating the most efficient kill. "Here's what's going to happen," Tom said, stepping fully into the cabin. Two more figures followed, men Ezra didn't recognize, wearing tactical gear that had no place in any legitimate law enforcement operation. "We're going to help you load the Chen woman onto one of the sleds. Transport her back to town for proper medical care." The words sounded reasonable, even compassionate. But Sarah's grip tightened on his shirt with desperate strength, and the smallest pup whimpered as if sensing the lie beneath Tom's practiced concern. "Awful thing," one of the tactical men said, his voice carrying a slight accent Ezra couldn't place. "Woman like that, dedicated to her work. Tragic accident, getting caught in a storm like this. Accident." The word hung in the air like cordite. They were already constructing the narrative. Sarah Chen, idealistic wildlife biologist, found dead from exposure after heroically attempting to save orphaned wolf pups. The kind of story that would play well in newspapers, complete with photos of her research station and quotes about the dangers of working alone in remote wilderness. No mention of murder. No investigation into systematic poaching operations. No uncomfortable questions about why a sheriff's deputy had been found dead near an illegal kill site. Ezra's mind raced through his limited options. 3 armed men in tactical gear, positioned between him and the only exit. Sarah too weak to move under her own power. 3 wolf pups that would die within minutes if separated from her body heat. His shotgun held 2 shells, enough to take down Tom and maybe one other, but not enough to fight his way clear of whatever backup waited outside. The mathematics of survival had never looked worse. "Storm's picking up," Tom continued, glancing toward the broken door frame where wind-driven snow was beginning to accumulate on the cabin floor. "Need to move soon if we want to get her to medical attention." Sarah's lips moved against Ezra's ear, her breath barely audible above the fire's crackling. "Research cache. Hidden drive. Coordinates 39.4. The numbers dissolved into unconsciousness as her body went limp, but the message was clear enough. She'd hidden backup files somewhere, evidence that could expose whatever corruption had killed Danny and nearly killed her. Evidence that Tom and his partners needed to destroy along with the woman who'd gathered it. "She's fading," the accented man observed, moving closer with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to violence. "Hypothermia is tricky. Sometimes they seem to recover right before the end." The casual expertise in his voice made Ezra's blood run cold. These men had done this before, had practice in making murders look like natural deaths. Sarah wasn't their first victim, just the most recent in a pattern that stretched back God knew how long. "You did good work finding her," Tom said. And for a moment his voice carried genuine warmth. Danny would be proud. His big brother, doing right by the mountain code. The manipulation was expertly done, appealing to everything Ezra had believed about family honor and wilderness justice. Accept the comfortable lie. Let them finish their work, return to a world where sheriffs were heroes, and justice followed familiar patterns. All he had to do was step aside and let nature take its course. The female pup chose that moment to open her eyes and look directly at him. Her gaze held no understanding of human politics or criminal conspiracies, only the simple trust of a creature that had already lost everything once and somehow survived. Her mother had died because she'd been in the wrong place when desperate men needed to send a message. Now her babies faced the same fate, caught between human greed and human conscience in a conflict that should never have involved them. Ezra thought of Danny's hands, gentle enough to coax orphaned animals to accept bottle feeding, but steady enough to bring down an elk at 300 yards. His little brother had died trying to save these pups from men who saw them as disposable complications in a larger game. The least Ezra could do was make sure that sacrifice meant something. "You're right," he said finally, his voice carrying across the cabin with deceptive calm. "Danny would be proud." Tom's smile broadened, relief flickering across his features. The sheriff holstered his sidearm and moved toward Sarah's still form, hands outstretched in a gesture of assistance that would become something else entirely once he got close enough. "Proud that I finally learned the difference," Ezra continued, "between justice and murder." His shotgun swung up with 40 years of muscle memory, the barrel finding Tom's center mass with mechanical precision. The sheriff froze mid-step, understanding flooding his expression like ice water. The real test was about to begin. The cabin air turned electric, with the kind of tension that preceded lightning strikes. Tom's hands hung suspended in space, caught between his abandoned holster and Sarah's vulnerable form, while his tactical companions shifted positions with the fluid precision of men who'd rehearsed this dance before. "Easy now, Ezra." Tom's voice held the practiced calm of someone who'd talked armed men down from ledges, but his eyes carried calculations that had nothing to do with de-escalation. "You're overwrought. Grief makes a man see conspiracies where there's just tragedy." The shotgun's weight felt different now. Not the familiar tool of mountain justice he'd carried for 4 decades, but something heavier, freighted with the knowledge that its next use would irrevocably define who Ezra Blackwood really was. Sarah's unconscious form pressed against his side, her breathing shallow but steady, while the 3 pups nestled in the crook of her arms like living evidence of his brother's final act of mercy. 40 years I've known you, Tom." Ezra's voice carried across the small space with deadly quiet. "Watched you work cases. Seen you handle evidence. Never once saw you arrive at a crime scene before the crime was reported." One of the tactical men, the one with the accent, took a careful step sideways, angling for a clear shot that wouldn't risk hitting the sheriff. Professional movement, executed with the kind of patience that spoke to extensive training and unlimited time. These weren't local thugs hired for a quick job. They were specialists, brought in for problems that required permanent solutions. "Storm delayed the radio traffic," Tom said, his hand still frozen in that gesture of false assistance. "Got the distress call hours ago." "From who?" Ezra pressed. "I never sent one." The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sarah stirred against his chest, consciousness swimming closer to the surface despite her body's exhaustion. Her hand moved instinctively to shelter the smallest pup, a mother's gesture that transcended species and circumstance. Tom's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the practiced mask of authority slipping just enough to reveal the cold calculation beneath. Sometimes good citizens report what they see. Mountain folk look out for each other. Mountain folk. Ezra tasted the words like poison. "Is that what you call the people who killed my brother?" The second tactical operative moved with spider-like precision, positioning himself near the cabin's single window. Escape routes were being systematically eliminated, the noose tightening with professional efficiency. These men had done this before. Isolated witnesses, controlled the narrative, cleaned up inconvenient truths that threatened larger operations. "Danny got himself mixed up in things he didn't understand," Tom said. And for the first time, his voice carried something that might have been genuine regret. "Good kid, but he always was too soft-hearted for his own good." Sarah's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. Her gaze found Ezra's face, then moved to the men surrounding them with predatory patience. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible, but every word carried the weight of dying testimony. GPS files, hidden cache, Tom's name, in the coordinates. The sheriff's facade cracked completely. "Shut her up." The accented man raised his weapon with mechanical precision, but Ezra shifted the shotgun barrel toward him in a movement that spoke of reflexes honed by decades of hunting dangerous game. The mathematics of violence hung in the air between them. 2 shells against 3 trained killers, Sarah too weak to run, 3 helpless animals caught in the crossfire of human corruption. "You want to know what really happened to Danny?" Tom's voice carried the edge of a man pushed beyond his breaking point. "He found our operation, sure enough. But instead of walking away like a smart man, he tried to play hero. Thought he could save some mangy wolf pups and expose what he called our criminal conspiracy." The truth hit Ezra like a physical blow. His brother hadn't stumbled into illegal activity. He'd discovered it deliberately, piece by piece, until the pattern became impossible to ignore. The guilty conscience, the nervous energy, the way Danny had avoided family gatherings in recent months. All of it pointed to a man gathering evidence against people he'd known his entire life. "How long?" Ezra asked. "Long enough to build something beautiful, Tom replied. Coordinated hunting across 3 counties, premium clients paying top dollar for guaranteed kills. No messy licenses, no seasonal restrictions, no federal oversight. Just pure mountain capitalism. The female pup opened her eyes and fixed them on Ezra, with that devastating trust that only the truly innocent could muster. Her mother had died to protect secrets that men like Tom would kill to preserve. Her siblings faced the same fate, orphaned by greed and scheduled for elimination by convenience. Outside, the storm howled with increasing fury, but inside the cabin, time seemed suspended in the space between heartbeats. Ezra felt the weight of Sarah's research pressing against his consciousness, months of careful documentation that had painted a picture too dangerous for its creator to survive. The real test wasn't about marksmanship or tactical advantage. It was about choosing who he wanted to be in the seconds that would define the rest of his life. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what would come next. Ezra felt the weight of 40 years of certainties crumbling beneath him like rotten timber. Everything he'd believed about honor, about justice, about the codes that governed mountain life, all of it had been a comfortable lie built over a foundation of corruption that reached back God knew how long. The female pup's trusting gaze pierced through his soul like Danny's voice from the grave. His little brother had died for these orphaned creatures, had chosen mercy over self-preservation in his final moments. The least Ezra could do was ensure that sacrifice meant something more than another convenient cover story for Tom's operation. Danny always was the better man, Ezra said quietly, his finger moving to the shotgun's trigger. Took me 58 years to figure that out. Tom's eyes widened as he recognized the shift in Ezra's stance, the subtle change from defensive positioning to lethal intent. Think about what you're doing, old friend. You kill a sheriff, you become the villain in this story. Nobody's going to believe some wild theory about conspiracy and corruption. You'll be just another crazy mountain man who snapped under pressure. The words carried the ring of truth. Tom had spent decades building his reputation, cultivating relationships throughout the county that would support whatever narrative he chose to construct. Ezra Blackwood, the hermit who'd isolated himself from civilization for the better part of a decade, would make a perfect scapegoat. A grieving brother driven to madness by loss, lashing out at the very people trying to help him. Sarah's hand moved weakly against his chest, fingers curling around something small and metallic. When her palm opened, Ezra saw a micro SD card, smaller than a fingernail but containing enough digital evidence to destroy Tom's entire operation. Her backup files, hidden from the research notebooks scattered around the cabin but preserved in a format that could reach the outside world if it survived the next few minutes. Upload. Automatic. If I don't check in, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the fire's crackling. 24 hours. Already passed. Tom heard enough to understand the implication. His carefully constructed empire wasn't just threatened by the evidence in this cabin, it was already compromised by safeguards he hadn't known existed. Sarah Chen hadn't been working alone. Her research was part of a larger network, a federal investigation that would continue even if she didn't survive to see it concluded. "You stupid bitch," Tom snarled, his mask of false concern finally dropping completely. "Do you have any idea how much money you've cost us? How many good men you've put at risk with your bleeding heart environmental bullshit?" The accented tactical operator shifted his position slightly, angling for a shot that would take out both Ezra and Sarah with a single burst. Professional efficiency, but also desperation. These men were no longer executing a planned operation. They were trying to contain a situation that had spiraled beyond their control. Ezra felt the familiar calm that came before violence, the crystal clarity that hunting dangerous game had taught him to embrace. His shotgun held 2 shells. The tactical team had automatic weapons and superior positioning. By any rational calculation, this was a losing proposition. But rationality had died the moment he'd chosen to save Sarah, instead of letting her freeze. Everything since then had been a step deeper into territory where courage mattered more than tactics, where doing right counted for more than doing smart. The smallest pup made a soft mewling sound, seeking warmth and comfort from a mother who couldn't provide either. Such a tiny noise, barely audible above the storm, but it cut through the cabin's tension like a knife through silk. These creatures had already lost everything once. They deserved better than becoming collateral damage in a war between human greed and human conscience. Last chance, Ezra. Tom's voice carried the weight of finality. Walk away. Take your grief back to that mountain cabin, and let us handle this mess. In 24 hours, you can read about the tragic accident in the local paper and get on with your life. The offer hung in the air like poisoned honey. Return to isolation, to the comfortable numbness of solitude where other people's suffering couldn't touch him. Accept the lie and let the truth die with Sarah Chen and 3 orphaned pups who had never asked to be born into a world where their existence threatened powerful men. Ezra thought of Danny's hands, gentle enough to bottle-feed abandoned animals, but steady enough to stand up to corrupt authority when standing up meant death. His little brother had faced this same choice in his final moments, safety through silence or justice through sacrifice. The decision had already been made 40 years ago, when Danny Blackwood had taught his older brother that some things mattered more than survival. "Go to hell," Ezra said, and pulled the trigger. The shotgun's roar filled the cabin like thunder trapped in a bottle, but the satisfaction Ezra expected never came. The blast caught Tom's center mass, spinning him backward into the cabin wall where he crumpled like a broken marionette, but the tactical men had been ready for this moment from the instant they'd entered the cabin. The accented operative's automatic weapon chattered its deadly response before the echo of Ezra's shot had faded. Pain exploded across Ezra's left shoulder as bullets found their mark, the impact spinning him away from Sarah's prone form and sending him crashing into Danny's overturned desk. His shotgun clattered across the floor, now useless with only 1 shell remaining against 2 trained killers who had him dead to rights. Sarah's scream cut through the gunfire, not fear for herself, but anguish as the smallest wolf pup was flung from her arms by Ezra's violent movement. The tiny creature hit the cabin wall with a sickening thud and lay motionless, its neck bent at an impossible angle. The other 2 pups writhed against Sarah's chest, crying out for warmth and protection she could no longer provide, as hypothermia reclaimed its hold on her failing body. "God damn it, Pavel!" the second tactical man shouted. "You were supposed to keep them alive until we could stage the scene." Blood poured from Ezra's shoulder, soaking his flannel shirt and pooling on the wooden floor beneath him. He tried to reach for his fallen weapon, but his left arm wouldn't respond, hanging useless at his side like a broken branch. Through the haze of shock and pain, he watched Tom's chest rise and fall in shallow, labored breaths. Still alive, but not for long. "Plans change," Pavel replied with cold professionalism, his rifle trained on Ezra's center mass. Sheriffs wounded, subjects became violent, tragic shootout in remote cabin. Story writes itself. Sarah was fading fast without Ezra's body heat to supplement her own. The 2 surviving pups pressed against her desperately, but her temperature was dropping by the minute. In 10 minutes, maybe 15, hypothermia would finish what Tom's corruption had started. The federal investigation she'd mentioned would find only bodies and a story carefully crafted to hide the truth. The micro SD card lay forgotten on the floor beside Sarah's outstretched hand, its data intact, but useless if there was no one left alive to authenticate its contents. Everything Danny had died for, the evidence of the poaching operation, the connections to powerful clients, the systematic destruction of protected wildlife, would disappear into whatever narrative Pavel and his partner chose to construct. Ezra's vision blurred as blood loss began to take its toll. He'd lived 58 years, most of them in comfortable isolation from the complexities of a world that demanded difficult choices from ordinary people. Danny had been the one with courage, the one who stood up for creatures that couldn't defend themselves. Now they were both going to die for that nobility, leaving behind only another mountain tragedy for the newspapers to sensationalize. "Check the sheriff," Pavel ordered his companion. "See if he's stable enough to tell his version of events." Tom's eyes fluttered open as the second tactical man knelt beside him, assessing the damage from Ezra's shotgun blast. Blood frothed at his lips, but consciousness remained sharp enough for him to recognize how completely his careful plans had unraveled. Too much noise, Tom gasped. Federal task force, monitoring communications. They'll come looking. The admission hit Ezra like a physical blow. Sarah's investigation hadn't been the isolated work of a single researcher. It was part of a coordinated federal operation that had been closing in on Tom's network for months. Danny's death hadn't stopped the investigation, it had accelerated it, turning a routine wildlife protection case into a murder investigation that would bring resources Tom couldn't hope to outmaneuver. But that knowledge would die with them in this cabin, unless someone survived to make contact with Sarah's handlers. The storm would cover the sound of gunfire, and by the time federal agents could reach the remote research station, there would be nothing left but bodies, and whatever story Pavel's team chose to leave behind. The remaining wolf pups had stopped crying, their small bodies growing still against Sarah's cooling chest. They would be the first to die, followed by the woman who'd tried to save them, then Ezra himself. 3 generations of sacrifice erased by men who saw murder as just another business expense. Through the cabin's broken door, wind-driven snow continued its relentless advance across the floor, nature slowly reclaiming a space where too much human blood had been spilled. The storm that had brought Ezra here would bury the evidence of his failure, and Danny's final act of mercy would vanish into the same mountain silence that had swallowed so many other inconvenient truths. Ezra closed his eyes and waited for Pavel to finish what the mountain had started.